As you all heard, we're going to be talking about youth and mental health, recognizing and responding. My name is Tanetta Hassel, and I am a licensed clinical social worker here at Western Tidewater CSB. I also hold a few outpatient clients, and I am the Suffolk clinic manager at our Suffolk office, which is right over here by OBC. And at this clinic, we house a couple different programs, one of those being our school intervention program. So I've probably met a few of you at some point or another, but we are present in the school system. We offer crisis response, case management, and some outpatient counseling. So we'll probably have some time to talk about that later, but that is a quick bit about me. Alrighty, so today we're going to be talking about a couple different things. I really wanted to start us off with talking about the power of reframing. We're going to talk about trauma, adverse childhood experiences, a very basic definition of mental illness, some typical behavior and warning signs you could look out for, some different signs and symptoms, physical, emotional, behavioral, and different thoughts and trigger words you could be looking for. We're going to be talking about some tips for recognizing signs in this virtual platform. It's new to all of us. It's going to be tough, but I do want to give you guys some things to look out for. Also, some tips for self-care and recognizing maybe even some burnout and compassion fatigue within yourself. There will be some resources, and then we will save time at the end for questions and comments. All right, additional housekeeping and some disclaimers. At some point, Natalia is going to put a link in the chat that you all must use to sign in. So it'll be a link, and once you click the link, it will ask you for an email address. You'll enter your email address. Please use your school email address. Once you log in, it'll ask for your name and your school. It'll also ask for a phone number, but that's not mandatory. However, it is mandatory that you sign in because we will need to turn in an attendance list after this. And there is slated to be close to 1,500 of you here. So the only way we're going to be able to keep track is if you sign in. So like Natalia said earlier, if you're not on a laptop and you can't access that link from your phone, you'll need to try and switch over so you can get that link so that we can give you credit for being here. The other thing I want to say is normally this would be in person. Normally, you know, I can feed off you guys' energy and we can really take some time to break some things down, especially if you hear anything that might be triggering. It's important to note that Natalia will be doing her best to monitor the chat. Both she and I are licensed clinicians. So if anything comes up and you need to message us privately, please do so, or even email us if you have some follow-up personal questions about your own mental wellness. But keep in mind that, you know, this is a safe space. We hope that you'll be able to take whatever you learn from here and apply it to not only your professional life, but your personal life. And what else? I think those are the biggest takeaways. So don't forget to sign up at some point. And if you have any ongoing questions or concerns throughout, utilize the chat or the question and answer format. You should see that little link at the bottom or the top of your screen. It'll say Q&A. Alrighty, so I want to personally challenge everybody to take a moment and think about or write down one thing that you want to take away from today. And if you're feeling extra bold and you want to see what your colleagues are hoping to learn or take away from today, you can go ahead and put it in the chat. While you guys are doing that, I'm going to pull up our first poll. And actually, Natalia, I'll need you to give me host back so I can pull up the polls. Did you already do it? Yep. Okay. All right. So while you're thinking about and writing down what you want to take away from today, I'm going to launch our first poll. So you can go ahead and read these polls and give your best answer. Everything is anonymous, so I can't see who is saying what, but we do have some answers coming through, and I'm taking a peek at the chat. People want to learn how to handle high stress situations, how to keep students calm and grounded virtually. Okay. Strategies for talking with parents. Some of these comments are funny. All right, we got a little over half of you have responded to the poll. So the first question in the poll, are you comfortable talking and thinking about mental wellness? About 1% of you have said no. 74% has said yes. And about a quarter of you have said it depends on the context. And the second question, are you familiar with adverse childhood experiences? I've heard of it, but that's it. About 20%, never heard of it. About 150 of you. Okay, that's exciting. Talking about ACEs is personally one of my favorite trainings and presentations to do. I hope we'll be able to do that one for you separately. Today will be just a pretty basic overview. And then we got about 46% of you that say you know a little, but you're interested in learning more. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. All right. Thank you guys for participating. All right. We're going to keep going. All right. So let me just go ahead and preface this slide by saying, if you don't remember anything from today, please remember this. The power of reframing is something that's almost impossible to measure. So the more you can start to have experiences with your students or even the people in your personal life and start to wonder what happened to you versus what's wrong with you, you open the door for almost, unlimited points of view for understanding and really learning how to intervene when it comes to mental health and mental wellness. Language itself is a tool to remove some of the stigma. So if you're in the helping field, you probably understand that there is still in 2020 a ton of stigma around mental wellness and what that really means. What does it mean to have a disorder or to have a mental illness? So the more you can reshape and reframe the idea of trauma, the better off your life and those who you touch will be. When we do the ACEs training, we have a very powerful YouTube video that we show, and that's really the takeaway, that you don't have to have these, letters behind your name or fancy training to take a moment and ask a question to somebody, just to open that door for open and honest communication. A couple things to note: trauma is a risk factor in almost every type of mental illness. That's pretty powerful when you think about it. I mean, as teachers, you're probably familiar with, your ADHDs and your conduct disorders and probably some depression and anxiety. Those words probably float around a lot. But I'm curious if you've ever really stopped to think how trauma could be impacting that. And what adverse childhood experiences, what the actual study, adverse childhood experiences, tells us and shows us is that trauma is very much correlated with ADHD and conduct disorders and depression and anxiety. So I just wanted to take a moment, and if you're taking notes, you can jot down a little bit about the adverse childhood experiences study. So it was actually done from 1995 to 1997, and it had over 17,000 participants. So if you've heard of adverse childhood experiences, you've probably seen the survey that comes along with it. Well, ACEs was actually a research project, if you will, The two co-investigators were actually originally interested in learning and studying about why do people continue to smoke cigarettes when they know it's harmful to their health, and why are women that have experienced sexual abuse more likely to be obese. So that's where they started. And the more they did their research, they started to think to themselves, is childhood adversity the origin of risk factors for major diseases and disability? So they were starting to see a lot of the people in their separate research studies had a lot of things in common. So they came together and they chose to create the hypothesis that yes, adverse childhood experiences will directly correlate with mental wellness and physical wellness or disabilities or diseases. So the actual 10 question survey was developed in response to that. So what did the ACE study really tell us? So first of all, it told us that adverse childhood experiences were common. I chose not to put the survey up here because sometimes the survey in itself can be triggering. And I always like to give the disclaimer that the survey should not be used as an assessment tool. That is not the purpose of the ACE survey. So even if after this presentation you choose to Google it and take the survey and see what your ACE score is, you have to understand that that is not a prescription, and it does not tell you anything but your risk factors. So what they learned is that people with higher ACE scores are more likely or more at risk for several other health factors. So the survey is really broken down into three main categories. There's a category about neglect, there's a category about abuse, and there's a category about, your general safety. So generally, once you respond, you'll get your ACE score. And, for people with higher ACE scores, as you see on your screen, an ACE score of 4 or more. So if you say yes to any one of those 10 questions, you get 1 point. And if you have a score of 4 or more, you could be 700% more likely to abuse alcohol. That's just one stat that I pulled to really demonstrate why we should be paying attention to adverse childhood experiences. Also, if you have an ACE score of 4 or more, you have 20 times the risk of attempting or completing suicide. Another very impactful stat that I thought would kind of help point your attention to why prevention is so important and why trainings like these are important, even if it only starts the conversation. And the other thing I really wanted to highlight is that ACE scores have a dose response. So essentially, for every 1 ACE score you have, you're more likely, it's like a ladder. It goes like this. You're more likely to be at risk for other health concerns like asthma. If you have a lot of students that come from a similar neighborhood or a similar background and you know some of their trauma and you're always curious, like, a lot of kids that come from this neighborhood have asthma. There's a lot of correlations with heart disease, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But overall, studies really point to the need for prevention to knock down the ACE scores of people in our community. And the number one way, if you're wondering to yourself, well, yeah, I myself have a high ACE score, or I know some students that have a high ACE score, what do I do? The number one way to counteract adverse childhood experiences is to really foster resilience where you can. As we go, let me make sure I have hit my points. Okay. Guys, this was really hard because there's so much I want to say about ACEs, but I'm going to keep it there. So here is if you are visual and you like these flow charts and graphics, this slide is a way to kind of connect ACEs and my power of reframing. So a lot of times we make these assumptions that people that live in chaotic home situations are going to be, bad, or they're going to come to school, or they're going to come to virtual learning, and they're not going to be able to sit still, they're not going to be able to focus, and we label that in our head as a negative thing. read a quote one time, and I forget exactly how it goes, but essentially it was saying, things don't become problematic or negative until your coping skills don't match with the environment that you're in. So if you look at this flow chart, you see everyone will have a neutral start. So if your home life and your experiences are preparing you to live and survive in an evil and chaotic world, then you're more likely to be edgy or hot-tempered or impulsive or hypervigilant. And this is good information too, because when you start to think about the parents that are going to have a little bit less patience with you as you try to teach them about this new way to learn, as you start to think about, other colleagues that you work with that seem to be kind of a little bit more impulsive than might make sense to you, you can start to ask yourself, well, what experiences did they go to? Instead of saying, oh, what's wrong with so-and-so? We're all guilty of it. Sometimes we catch ourselves talking about parents and you say, Miss Johnny Appleseed is one of those parents. Well, that might be true, but now you can start with the power of reframing. You can start thinking about, well, what did Miss Johnny Appleseed experience in her life that makes her present as more edgy or hypervigilant? And then understand that that presentation that you see in a certain environment might seem like it doesn't match that environment, but where she is from, she's adapted to survival. And those character traits that you see are actually strengths. And so what ACEs tells us is that there are ways to take these skill sets and make them adaptable across multiple environments. So if I were doing the ACEs training and we were live and in person, I would ask some people to shout out, well, what types of jobs would be good for people on this bottom row that live in chaos and are prepared for a tough life? And people would shout out things like, firefighter, or, working for 911, first response, those types of jobs, military. And, on the other hand, we have the top row that says there are some people who are prepared for life in a more peaceful, quiet, benevolent world. They might present as more laid back, relationship oriented, and they might think things through more. And they're more adapted to live in peaceful environments. And so we might unintentionally reward those children or those parents or those colleagues that really present to be more well adapted for what our personal goal is. But remember, if you take nothing else away from today, just remember that everybody is prepared in a different way to kind of navigate different situations, and it all could be strengths. We just got to kind of adjust our expectations. All right, so what is mental illness or a mental disorder? This definition is going to be very basic and maybe controversial depending on who you ask. But a mental disorder or a mental illness is a diagnosable illness that affects a person's thinking, emotional state, and behavior. So I really wish I could see you guys' faces, because I would ask, why do you think I italicized diagnosable? Now answer this to yourself and think to yourself what your best guess will be. And then I'm just going to tell you in a minute, because I don't want to flood the chat again. But I italicized the word diagnosable because I am a clinician, I am a social worker by training, and I don't love that we have to actually diagnose these things for people to take signs and symptoms seriously. So the truth is, mental wellness, and I'm going to emphasize wellness because I'm very strengths-based, mental wellness is a spectrum. So sometimes we're on this end of the spectrum where we feel great, where we feel, our best selves. Sometimes we're all on the other end of the spectrum where we're not doing too hot. Like right now, we're all in a pandemic. We're all dealing with chaos. We're all dealing with immense stress that is unimaginable. So your mental wellness might be all over the place. I know many teachers. My husband is a teacher, so I get it. Like, So that word diagnosable is a little bit uncomfortable for me at times, but for all intents and purposes, and this very general overview, it is important because what it does is it emphasizes the impact of how your mental health kind of impairs your day-to-day things, like your ability to go to work, your ability to attend school, your ability to carry out your daily activities, and your ability to really engage in satisfying relationships. So when we say diagnosable, mental health professionals and medical doctors and psychiatrists, we use what's called the DSM. I don't have my DSM with me, but it's a big, thick old book, looks like a dictionary. And it has, almost hundreds of different disorders and disabilities in there that we can really use to try and better understand an individual and try and better understand how to treat them. So as teachers and as professionals within the school system, I don't want you guys to walk away from today and think that we expect you to know all of those disorders and know what's in the DSM. What we really want you to focus on is recognizing the signs and symptoms. Because if you ask me, that's the most important part anyway, because that's what when they get to us for therapy or mental health treatment, that's what we're really working on. And the actual label is more so we can understand, the different categories of treatment. Let's see how the chat is looking. One thing that you guys can go ahead and throw in the chat are some of the terms you all have heard from your students. Oh, I did see somebody ask what DSM stands for. It's like Diagnostic Statistical Manual, something. We're on the DSM-5. So if you want to go ahead and Google it, mental health and medical professionals, we're on the 5th version of this book. It takes quite some time for all the powers that be to come together and create it. But what you can type in the chat are some terms that you may have heard your students use to describe individuals that might be struggling with their mental health. So usually when I'm doing this in person, I hear a whole lot of negative terms, and that is a reflection of the stigma that is attached to mental wellness. Oh yeah, you guys have heard a lot. I see that chat going. I love the participation. It almost makes me feel like I'm not alone in this thing. Yeah, and so when I hear some of the terms, I challenge the participants to really tell me how you might take that and reframe it for somebody. So that's something you can be thinking to yourself as well. All right, let's go to the next slide. So we are going to be looking at some typical behavior versus warning signs. So I underline typical on purpose because what I hear a lot as somebody who, loves getting out and doing these trainings is people will ask, well, how do I know if somebody's normal? Or what's not normal? That term is really dangerous because there's no such thing as normal. You really have to establish a baseline for yourself and for the person you're working with. And then based on that baseline, you're going to be looking at what's typical and what's not typical. So, in other words, what happens more often than not, because that's their baseline. And then when they deviate from that consistent what happens more often than not, that's when we're looking at atypical. And then that's when we might be asking some questions. So is the youth struggling in school? Are they struggling in social settings? Are they struggling in daily activities? And establishing a baseline in the virtual platform will be more difficult, and later on I'll actually give you some steps. It might seem more difficult in the beginning, but I think our own stress and anxiety sometimes keep us from feeling confident in ourselves. But from day one, in those first few weeks of schools, you'll be constantly assessing and you'll be seeing what's typical for your students. And then as time goes on, we'll be able to assess that and use that as a comparison, if you will, to determine if something is atypical. So here's an example. If you work with little kids, it might be a little bit different. If you work with middle school, high school, this will be kind of a helpful jumping off platform for you. So typical young people, as they get older, they'll want to separate from family and they'll want to spend more time with friends. A potential warning sign is when they want to withdraw from friends, family, and all social activities. So for your younger kids, like your elementary, that stage of development, it's still pretty normal to be very like self-centered and not in a negative way, but to still feel like the world, everybody else thinks like I think. So when I say self-centered, that's what I mean. So it's typical for a very young student to want to still get input from an adult or still, need that protective factor, that blanket. So if you see a little bit of regression with this pandemic and having to do online learning, like they want to bring a teddy bear, or they want to bring a blanket, or some people call it a lovey, that wouldn't necessarily be atypical for that age group. Now, a potential warning sign for that age group might be completely shutting down when they typically were very outgoing and welcoming and loving. It's typical for children as they get older to want more privacy. That's different than becoming secretive and then angry, like they're hiding something, or they need to be away from you, or it's just completely off limits. And also, it's typical for students or youth to want to transition from things they liked when they were younger to a more older, more mature interest. It's a potential warning sign if they start losing interest in their favorite activities and not replacing that with other things, whether it's new things that they're interested in or new things that their friends are interested in. Yeah, so that is just meant to give you an idea. Hope you guys are hanging in there with me. So we're going to move on and talk about some specific signs and symptoms you could look for and listen for, especially in this virtual setting. I will give you a disclaimer that these slides have a lot of words, but for some of the things I'm going to be talking with you about, that's kind of important because we want you to look and actually skim and then see what jumps out at you. So, signs and symptoms, physical signs and symptoms. So immediately I'm going to ask you to look at this and ask yourself what jumps out at you. So most people will be a little bit surprised that your mental wellness could have such an impact on your physical wellness. And when you actually take the youth mental health first aid, that full training, one of the points we try to drive home is that mental health is just as important as physical health. And they're very intercorrelated. So if you're looking at this slide and you're thinking to yourself, wow, this sounds a lot like, anxiety. When I get anxiety, my heart beats fast. I had a little bit of anxiety when we were starting this presentation, and I noticed, wow, my mouth got dry. But then if I drink too much water, I'm gonna have to get up and go use the restroom, and I can't do that until we have a break. So keeping in mind that some of this is typical that you'll go through. I'm curious what stands out to people. Think it to yourself. Notice what stands out. But keep in mind, there's a lot of correlations here. Sometimes when I do this live, people will say, oh, it sounds a lot like, like maybe you're having a heart attack. How would you differentiate an anxiety attack from a heart attack? Because a lot of these physical signs and symptoms overlap. Well, the answer is, as a person that is witnessing it, is you don't have to differentiate it. You don't have to be able to tell the difference between a heart attack and an anxiety attack. You just need to understand the signs and symptoms and that it's serious, and that would be a great time to intervene. And if you don't know the best way to intervene, you have a couple options. You can contact a first aider, whether it's a physical, person that's gone through the first aid classes, or whether it's somebody that's gone through a mental health first aid class, to come and respond and kind of diffuse and neutralize the situation. All right, let's go on to the next one. Some more signs and symptoms, physical. So if you have kids that are logging on to, virtual classroom and they are consistently unkempt, or if you notice their eyes are bloodshot or glassy, or there's weight gain or weight loss, or they talk to you about not eating at all or sleeping much more or much less. Again, it's not your job to diagnose them right away and say, oh my gosh, you must be experiencing depression. More or less, it's you're establishing their baseline and you're noting that these things could be a warning sign. And I'm just going to pay attention to this more often now. Are they not sleeping because their schedule's been messed up because, for 3 or 4 or 5 months straight, they've kind of been, doing their own thing on their own regimen. So just keeping in mind that everything up here are, potential warning signs and good information for you to have and for you to know. So when we are thinking about emotional and behavioral signs and symptoms, I really want to emphasize here, some of these words are intentionally expressing the impact and the level of these things. So if you've ever met a child, a youth person, you know that they can inherently sometimes be emotional. I mean, even adults sometimes are inherently, more emotional than others. That in and of itself is not necessarily a sign or symptom for mental unwellness. However, when you pair it with other signs and symptoms, so if they are not eating, not sleeping, and now they're acting erratic, they are oversensitive to comments or criticism. They have really low self-esteem. They have excessive irritability or anger. See these words? They're meant to display the intensity of these things that you see. So if they're having a complete inability to manage responsibilities. So we're all going to struggle a little bit, but complete inability, complete obsessive or avoidance, those are the things that really should stick out to you and have you start to question, okay, is this their typical behavior or is it something more? Mm-hmm. Let's move on. So this is always a tough slide to kind of talk about sometimes because you might be thinking to yourself, how am I going to hear my students' thoughts? And I'm not going to lie, we will have to have some ongoing conversations around this because typically you have to be able to engage in a conversation to really, get at what somebody might be going through internally. And there will be some tips on how to start a conversation, but one of the things you could be looking for, because again, you can take this outside of your professional life and use it in your personal life, that if somebody has really, really rigid thinking or really extreme racing thoughts or frequent self-criticism or self-blames, these could be warning signs, could be symptoms. Some of the more apparent things like odd ideas, like, okay, if I run and jump out of this window, I'll be able to fly. or delusions. So I want to take a moment and talk about the difference between delusions or hallucinations, because if you watch some popular television shows, I don't know if they do a great job of really explaining that. So a delusion could be something that in another context might seemingly be true. So there's a range of delusions. So they could be more subtle, like everybody in a red car is following me. Now I say that because I drive a red car, and I might notice that there's a lot more red cars on the road, and every time I pull into a gas station, so does another red car. So me, I'm able to rationally think through that, and I'm just saying that, oh, well, I just got a red car, so I'm noticing all these other red cars, so that's why I'm noticing that. Somebody with a true delusion might not be able to differentiate that. So it's something that maybe or maybe not is true. They might actually have a stalker that drives a red car. So we would need to flesh that out a bit. You know, that's not necessarily your job as a teacher to do that, or, you know, an education professional, but it is good to know that some delusions can be a little bit more difficult to flesh out. You know, your more extreme delusions might be, you know, I have a baby with Teddy Roosevelt and somebody kidnapped them. That's an actual delusion of a client that I've worked with before. So that's a more extreme version, and then there's more a subtle version, where hallucinations can be auditory, they can be visual. So I might have auditory hallucinations where I have voices in my head that maybe I can differentiate, maybe I can't. Maybe they're nice voices, maybe they're mean voices, maybe they tell me to do stuff, maybe they're just there. Or I can see things, I can see shapes or figures and things like that. So just making note of the language that your students use, what sorts of things they talk about. If they have really, if they're really fixated on certain things, those can be reflective of your thoughts. And then what I encourage you to do is, you know, process it through with somebody else, process it through with a parent, process it through with a mental health professional. If you're not sure and you want to get some more insight on, is this a sign or a symptom? Is this something that we might want to take a look at, or is it okay? All right, so typically, again, another activity I would do to kind of get us up and get some blood flowing, if we were in person. So take a moment, if you didn't stand up during the break, to stand up. Oops. And we are going to do a quick activity, but we're going to do it by a poll, where I'm going to put up 5 different facts, or, you know, 5 different pieces of information, and I want to see if you guys think it's fact, fiction, or somewhere in between, meaning that maybe it's true, maybe it's not, you're not really sure, but I am curious. So I've launched the poll, so you should see it. You should see 5 different pieces of information that you get to decide is fact, fiction, or somewhere in between. So the first one is self-harm is a mental illness. Second one is self-harm can be a good thing. The other one is, if you ask a young person about their self-harm or suicidal intentions, you will encourage the person to harm themselves or make their symptoms worse. Fourth one, toxic stress during key developmental periods can alter the size and or density of your brain. And 5, psychiatrists generally know which medications to prescribe for specific symptoms. So I'm going to give you guys a couple minutes, since there's so many of you, and you got to read through and you're curious what other folks are saying. Keep in mind this is anonymous, so all I'm seeing is the bar go up for whatever you're answering. Hopefully you all have access to the poll. If you don't, it's okay. It's not mandatory. It's just going to will give me an idea of how you guys are thinking and feeling. We got a little over half of you done, so I'm going to give it about 45 more seconds, and then I'm going to show you guys the poll results, and then I'm going to end your curiosity and tell you what the answers are. All right. I don't know if that was 45 seconds, honestly, but I'm going to go ahead and end it. And I'm sharing the results, so hopefully you can see it. So, information fact number 1, self-harm is a mental illness. You guys, the majority said fact. That is actually fiction. Now, if you're running around screaming, let me tell you why that is fiction. So, self-harm is actually a behavior that can be a symptom of mental illness, such as depression or something like psychosis or personality disorder, and it can become addictive. But self-harm in and of itself is not a mental illness. Remember how I said mental illness and I italicized diagnosable? Self-harm, you will not find that in the DSM. So technically it is not mental illness in and of itself. So make sure you share that with people in your lives, because that is another way to debunk stigma, is by getting these myths out of here and giving people factual information. So self-harm is not a mental illness. It is a behavior. Second one, self-harm can be a good thing. Wow, 82% of you said fiction. All right, so let me break this down for you before I give everybody a heart attack. So remember how I said the power of reframing is important? So if we are thinking about least harm, and if we're thinking about viewing somebody, whether they be a youth or an adult, in the most positive light, then self-harm could be a good thing. We're not saying that it is, we're saying that it could be. And it could be a good thing because self-harm is a step or 2 or 3 before suicide. So in other words, if you are self-harming, that means you are trying to find a way to cope with your situation instead of immediately ending your life. So it may actually prevent suicide. So if you can detect that somebody in your life, personal or professional, or even yourself, are thinking about considering self-harm or have already done self-harm, then you have an opportunity to intervene. So it is a fact. It could be a good thing. We're not just saying that it is. And also, if you are self-harming, you might be finding some temporary relief. And to me, as a therapist, that means you have the potential, you have the capacity to think outside of the box. That means I have an opportunity to help you see that there are healthier ways to get relief from your signs and symptoms. So I'm going to see that as a chance to intervene. I also want to make a note that self-harm is not just cutting. Self-harm could be, burning yourself. It could be intentionally overeating or undereating. It could be pinching yourself. It could be overdosing. It could be intentionally staying in an unhealthy relationship because you think you don't deserve better. So self-harm could run the gamut. But overall, the last thing I'll say is it could be seen as a chance to intervene. Number 3, if you ask a young person about their self-harm or suicidal intentions, you will encourage the person to harm themselves or make their situations or their symptoms worse. So you guys said, the majority of you said that is fiction, and you are correct. The opposite of that is true. So all of the research and scientists say, and even if you are comfortable with asking these questions directly, you would know from personal experience that asking somebody directly about their suicidal feelings will often normalize talking about mental wellness. It'll often lower their anxiety, and it'll also distract them. It'll also give them a chance to talk to somebody about what they're experiencing instead of this internal battle they might be having over the issue. Number 4, toxic stress during key developmental periods can alter the size or density of your brain. Fact. You guys are smart. That is absolutely a fact. So in the ACEs training that we do, we go into a lot more detail about toxic stress, about brain development, about the different areas in your brain. And again, another plug, I hope we get to do that for you guys because it's really invaluable information. But toxic stress is any type of stress hormone that's present in your body for longer than 20 minutes at a time. So stress hormones are healthy and normal part of human functioning. We want to have stress hormones because they help us with our fight, flight, or freeze response. It helps us survive. What we don't want is for our immune systems to stay over triggered for more than 20 minutes at a time. So what's supposed to happen is your stress hormones are supposed to flood your body, flood your brain, get you to safety, and then slowly it's supposed to dissipate. Your body's supposed to process it out, flush it out. Toxic stress is when you never get a chance to calm down. It just stays there. And then that it becomes toxic because it's not supposed to be there, and it starts to kill certain brain cells. And what I'll say really quickly is when that starts to happen, let's say you experience toxic stress and you have your elementary school teacher and they're experiencing tons of toxic stress when they're 5, and then by the time they get to middle school, you expect them to be able to sit in a classroom or be responsible enough to do their homework on their own without supervision. And those are some very basic skills they're struggling with. It could be because they're just a teen. It could be because they just want to be defiant, but it could also be that they have a high ACE score, they experience high levels of toxic stress, and now they have an inability to do that right now, and they need to be taught resilience in order to gain that new skill. And number 5, psychiatrists generally know which medications to prescribe for specific symptoms. 55% of you said in between. That was supposed to be a tricky question. It's definitely in between. So psychiatrists, they go to school, they learn a lot about how medications and chemicals react in the body, but because humans are all different, we all have different rates of metabolizing medications. Our body and our chemistry inside of us could have us respond very differently to different medications. So really, psychiatrists are giving us what has been scientifically proven to help, but they might have to change dosage. Usually they start you low and work you up. So I put that in there because a lot of times when we are working with children and maybe we make the recommendation for an IEP meeting or a 504, and we also encourage parents to speak to a medical professional that can prescribe medication. You got to understand sometimes there can be a gap between when that's going to take effect. So even if they go to their appointment and they get their medication on January 1st, you might not see an impact until 90 days from that. So just keep in mind that there is some trial and error. There is some unpredictable factors such as how an individual will respond to the medication, a bunch of things that go into that. All right, so let's move on because I see a lot of you during the break were asking, what do I do with this information? And that's a loaded question because one, I wish I had years to teach you all everything that you would need to know, but 2, we're going into a new era where a lot of factors will be out of our control, and that's very uncomfortable. But we want to take some time to reassure you that we are putting our brains together and coming up with some resources that you can have right on hand while you're in your classroom, some numbers and people that you can call when you feel like it's just out of your area of expertise. So you won't be alone in this. You will have supports, and you'll have supports for your families, for your students, and we will be here to support you directly. So I just wanted to say that and go ahead and get that out of the way before I actually give you just some tips and pointers and an overall, like an acronym on how to respond. So I am borrowing this acronym from Youth Mental Health First Aid. Hopefully you all will have a chance to take it, but it's really, it's called ALGE, and it's a straightforward and simple way to to learn how to respond. So the A in ALGE really stands for assess. So the first half of this presentation, we gave you a whole lot of background information that you can use to really, assess the situation. So you're assessing the situation to establish a baseline for yourself, for your students, or even for your students' family. So once you feel like you've established a baseline, you can start to assess whether these are typical or atypical behaviors. So their physical, emotional, behavioral, and thoughts, are they typical or atypical? So that's your A. The L is listen non-judgmentally. Seems straightforward, but it's very difficult. It's very, very difficult to let your guard down and not think you know all the answers and to just listen. So on your screen, you will see some tips for listening non-judgmentally and really engaging in a conversation. So it's important that when you do go to respond, you use I statements. So I noticed, Johnny Appleseed, that you've been coming to our virtual classroom extra sleepy. So I would guess that you'd be sleepy because your patterns are probably off, but you seem a little bit more sleepy than I thought that you would. Non-judgmentally, I just noticed something. I wanted to point it out. And then I want to leave some silence for you to respond. So you can ask some questions, but don't push. Kids have a radar. They can sense when you're just trying to get in their business or whatnot, or when you just don't care, they can sense that. So also keep in mind, it may be a relief for a young person to talk about how they feel. I don't know if any of you are parents. I'm going to assume at least a good bit of you are, but sometimes when you're a parent, it's hard to listen without inserting your own experiences because you want better for your children. You want to help them avoid the mistakes that they've made. Well, if this is a student or even a child of somebody at one of your social activities that you engage in, keep in mind they might already have a parent in their life doing that. So maybe when they come to talk to you, you can just listen. And really give them the space to be themselves. And remember that it's about them. It's not really about you. So 2020 is a different beast. It's just a different beast in and of itself. This age is something different. The amount of social unrest and this pandemic and, uncertainty is just, it's hard to fathom. And so our youth that we're working with are going to have a whole different perspective than what we might have had growing up or even our parents did. So they need our empathy. And they just need us to make space for them when it's appropriate. So let's keep on. So the G in ALGE is for giving reassurance and information. So it is okay to have realistic expectations. It's okay to offer consistent emotional support. It's not okay to give advice. It's not okay to focus on what's right or what's wrong. So at the end of the last academic year, I had a beautiful opportunity to partner with Crystal Fields, who I'm sure a lot of you elementary folks know, and we did a lot of like professional development trainings where we got to zoom in on, giving specific examples of how to talk to your children, what to use in the classroom, all of that. And so I hope we can continue to bring those to you, but there is a very different approach from giving practical help and realistic information, but telling a youth what's right or wrong. Because remember that wrong behavior in the school environment is a survival technique outside of it. So just keep in mind that matters. And these are some examples. If you're struggling to know what's the difference between reassuring information versus advice. So reassuring information is, hey, that test that we have coming up is going to be really, really hard. It's completely normal for you to feel a little bit worried because this is new for all of us. Versus advice, I think that, this is what you need to do to take care of your anxiety if you have anxiety about X, Y, and Z. The examples on the slide, breakups can be tough. It's natural for you to be hurt and upset. Versus I remember my first breakup, here's what you need to do. One of my favorite ones is to just tell people you are not alone versus you'll get over it. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it too much. You probably have found yourself saying that advice with no ill intentions, but just keep in mind how that could impact a youth. That could be dismissive. So just be mindful. The first E in algae is encouraging professional help. I briefly mentioned it before. You might feel out of your element when it comes to mental health. We want to continue to provide ongoing training for you. Suffolk Public Schools does. I know that seeing a trauma-informed care school system is important, and that's what we really need to have the balances that we want. But in the meantime, until you feel completely confident, or even after that, because it's not necessarily your job to be a teacher and a mental health professional, you can encourage it. I always say, however, when I'm doing this in person, and the second E is encouraging self-help and other strategies, is that therapy is not for everybody. I know that might be taboo because I do therapy. I'm a licensed mental health professional, but I can recognize and I can respect the fact that not everybody's ready for therapy, and it's not going to be your most effective intervention. So when you're thinking about how to respond to your students and families, identify who their other support systems might be. Help them think about activities that might help them better manage their symptoms, and let them think about strategies that interest them and discuss some self-help things, and just try as best as you can to engage the family as well as the young person. And not everything is bad. One of the things you can do when you're encouraging self-help is really identify some protective factors. So if they can get some exercise in, even if it's running around their living room in a circle because it's not safe to go outside, or if they don't have space in their living room to run around, doing some jumping jacks, doing some sit-ups, crunches, whatever, do some dance videos on YouTube, whatever could be self-protective factors to help counteract some of their risk factors. So I said earlier that virtual platform will be very different. It's very new. I was taking some time to look at the research that's out there and try to synthesize the research for you guys. But the truth is we're all learning. There's not huge data sets that reflect what we are undertaking right now, but there were some things that just might give you some reassurance and encouragement as we embark on this journey together. The first one being trust your instincts. So if you were going through this presentation and you realized, oh my God, what if these signs and symptoms apply to me? Like, what if it's me? You can recognize that and honor that. And in a couple slides, I'll go into a little bit more detail about it. But once we navigate your own mental health and you feel grounded, you've got to remind yourself that I know what I'm doing. Like, I have interacted with children before, I've interacted with families before. Yes, we're through a screen, but I can still pay attention and establish a baseline. I can still notice their tone. I can still notice their speech patterns. I can still try and notice to the best of my ability how focused they are, their body language. Body language is a huge nonverbal form of communication that can point out signs and symptoms. All the things that you know. What are your standard metrics? Look at the change in their quality of work. Everybody's going to struggle in the beginning, but soon you'll see a baseline emerge, and then you can start to use that to notice if there's a change in the quality or the timeliness or the efficiency of their work. Of course, be intentional about what it is you want to do. So one of the reasons I asked that fact or fiction question is because a lot of people get nervous about being intentional or direct, but everything points to that's the best way to intervene. And of course, keeping open lines of communication. Some people ask about focus when you're with your students. There's this thing called bilateral stimulation that really helps reboot and refocus, and you can do it virtually. You can walk your students through it. You can do it yourself. Like if you find that you've been sitting too long and it's hard, you're getting distracted, you want to do something with both sides of your body at the same time. Some of you might have heard it as crossing the midline, where you do that thing where you stick your arms out in front of you with your palms facing down, and then you face your palms outward, cross your arms over, link your fingers so you're like holding your own hands crossed over, and then pull your arms in towards your chest. That's one example of bilateral stimulation. And what you're doing is you're helping both sides of your brain talk to each other so that it's a little bit more easy to focus. Maybe you've had to do it today while I was presenting just so you didn't fall asleep, but you could also do anything. You can get up and walk in a circle. You can have them stand up and touch their toes with their, right hand to their, left foot, something that will help them use both sides of their body. It's a good reboot. I mentioned earlier that resilience is also a #1 way to combat adverse childhood experiences. Here it is bigger. So virtually, you'll have to rely a lot on your language. So keeping in mind that you can encourage resilience in children with just your words. So telling them that they're brave for taking on this journey with you of doing virtual learning. Reminding them that, hey, you've done this before, so I know you can do it again. Really affirming, positive, uplifting language. All of that can help to foster resilience. And the more resilience you have, the more likely that when you face adverse experiences, you'll feel more prepared to tackle them. So a little bit more specific talk and chatting about what if you notice the warning signs within yourself. So plot twist, if you didn't know, burnout is real. Burnout is real, compassion fatigue is real. And there's some links in here when you get this for some quick quizzes and questionnaires to help you do some assessing. Like if you're not sure if you're experiencing burnout, or if you're not sure if you're experiencing compassion fatigue, there are some resources in here. Really quickly, compassion fatigue is different from burnout. Compassion fatigue is when you work directly with individuals or families who experience some type of trauma and they have some type of trauma expression in their day-to-day. So a lot of the families that we serve experience trauma, whether they're military families, whether they come from food scarcity regions in Suffolk, whether they lack, a safe home or a safe neighborhood. There's lots of different types of trauma. So lots of the students and populations we serve have PTSD-like symptoms, and we're just constantly working with them. And then we start to absorb that same presentation, like we're always edgy, we're always anxious. Maybe we start to feel avoidant. That's compassion fatigue. You can experience compassion fatigue and burnout. That's when you're at super high risk and you need to start to try and apply what we discuss here today for youth to you. Because the truth is, it's really not that much different. The way that you respond to youth is the way that you should try and respond and treat yourself. Establish your baseline. Take notes in a journal, do whatever works for you, use your phone, but establish your baseline. If you want, identify an accountability partner or your own support systems. Notice your self-talk and inner thoughts. So notice what you're saying to yourself. Are you saying, this is going to be impossible, there's no way I'm going to survive this school year this way? That's self-talk. That fuels very specific thoughts. And those thoughts will fuel very specific behaviors. So notice that and try to redirect it. If you're struggling with redirecting those things on your own or finding alternative self-help and self-care things, that's when you might want to seek a professional. And so that's what this bullet point is about, identifying the help that makes most sense for you. One of the perks, I will say, of the pandemic is that we have transitioned to online virtual support. And all you have to do is call our same-day access line. And you can just make it very clear, I work with Suffolk Public School, and I'm calling because I just need to talk with somebody because I'm struggling. or I'm calling because I'm looking for outpatient therapy and I need to do it virtually, you know, or I'm calling to get some more information for somebody that I work with and I want to get them some help. You can call. You can also email us. I'll put up, we have an email address where you can just email it directly and try and establish services. But you guys, I want everyone, listening, to know that all the resources we talked about, all the tips, are equally accessible by you all as it is for our youth and our families. You'll also have some national resources if you feel like you need something more broad, less local. And also, this is one of my favorite resources for LGBTQ considerations, the trevorproject.org. There's also a 24/7 hotline and texting line, and a safe kind of like, it's called trevorspace.org, but it's kind of like a web-based chat group thing. It's an affirming community for those 13 to 24 that you could really use. Also, when you get this, you will have some links to some specific information, like 6 ways for educators to avoid compassion fatigue, some different tips and information on mindfulness, teaching and understanding students that appear to be difficult, some different books that you can get for your children. There are lots of ways that you can learn more. We were crunched on time today, but you can email us. You can ask your principals and admin and your leadership teams about bringing youth mental health first aid to your schools specifically. If you want to learn more about adverse childhood experiences, let us know. That training can be anywhere from 2 hours to 4 hours long. If you want some specialized professional training, like what I partnered with, Crystal Fields and did, those were only 35 to 45 minutes long, and we got to be very targeted and specific and go into more detail about the topics that you all felt that you needed. Okay, and we're wrapping up here, and we're gonna have a few minutes to look at the questions that I am pulling up. One of the questions in the Q&A, not necessarily the chat, but I'm looking in the question and answer portion, is will we eventually have available training on how to respond to a mental illness crisis situation? So I've mentioned mental health first aid several times. Mental health first aid is just like what, like a physical first aid that the Red Cross might do. Is it Red Cross? My brain's turning to mush. But when you go through the training and you learn how to do CPR and all of that, your physical first aid, mental health first aid is the same thing. It's designed to teach you how to respond in a crisis situation. I don't know how we're going to set that up for you guys, but I would love to find ways to offer it for everyone. We are brainstorming as a CSB how to resume our mental health first aid training that we used to do, and they were open for people to register via Eventbrite. So as we make more developments on that, we'll share that information. Somebody has asked, will you explain emergency services and mobile crisis? Absolutely. So we have a 24/7 emergency services line. You can call that line if you feel like somebody is in an active mental health crisis, meaning they are at imminent risk of self-harm or they are at imminent risk of harming somebody else. And they can direct your response, essentially. They will likely encourage your next steps, whether it be to get them to the hospital or whether it be to get them to somebody to do an in-person evaluation. So that's kind of what emergency services. Mobile crisis is a program that Western Tidewater has. It's now a regional program where we can actually go out and physically respond to mental health crises for youth throughout our region. And so a lot of you might have been familiar with it with the threat to harm assessments we did, we'd come directly to the school and complete them. Well, now we're able to go out into the community so we can continue to make that service available, do some crisis assessment, and connect them to, you know, our families and youth to resources within the community. Once we get you guys a resource list, we'll have all the contact information for both of those programs. The 758-5106 number is a general catch-all number. So if you're just overwhelmed, too much information, and you just need one number to call, you can start there and we can help filter you from that. And are there people in the school trained for immediate response with training on mental health crisis? So the good news is we're still maintaining our partnership with Suffolk Public Schools, Western Tidewater, so that we can still have our case managers stationed on site to be there to support you guys as you need it and respond to our families, you know, virtually until it's safe to return. So the short answer is yes. I guess the longer answer is hopefully we'll be able to train more people. Your school counselor should also be trained on mental health first aid, or they'll be getting retrained soon, so they will also be a resource. Yes, we will definitely get an updated list of contacts to school counselors and everything. We've, as you can imagine, with the pandemic, we've gone through several changes ourselves. So as soon as we have it, we will get it to you. It'll be ready by the first day of school. So you will have that. Let's see. Okay. I don't want to butcher your name. Grio? Did I say it right? I see you saying that you are involved with NAMI. Grio? But, oh, yay. Okay. Willing to volunteer in whatever way becomes available. That's good to know. Thank you. Okay. Any other questions?
Hey, Tanetta, I did see in our very active chat, first of all, thank you for all your kind words, everybody. I did see a question pop up at some point about whether Western Tidewater can be an alternative for calling police in the case of a mental health crisis. And I thought we could spend a second to clarify that, because it very much depends on the crisis.
Absolutely.
So I'll back to you for that.
Absolutely. So I know if you're watching the news, that's probably a question that's coming up for you a lot. First of all, I just want to say I appreciate you for being thoughtful enough to think about that. So good for you. What I would say is you have to be very careful, and the first thing you would want to do is assess the risk of physical harm and whether or not you feel as though the police are needed to kind of keep everybody safe. Western Tidewater individuals, we are trained in a very specific hold technique, but we do not want to implement that on school grounds where possible. So 9 times out of 10, what we would do is contact one of our CIT officers, and they are specifically trained in more specific mental health based interventions, so that they and Natalia, do you remember what CIT stands for? I know we use a lot of acronyms, but essentially they've been through more specific mental health based training, and they work very closely with like Centera Obisi, and so they've witnessed critical incident training. Thank you, Demetrius. Lost my train of thought, but essentially what I was saying is if you feel as though there is not an imminent threat to physical harm and you want to give us a call first, or emergency services first, that would be our first step too. We would contact one of our CIT officers that could help accompany us depending on how agitated or elevated or what type of psychosis the person we're responding to is experiencing. I hope that helped. Let me know if it didn't, if you need more explanation.
It looks like we have some questions about TDT. I would probably direct those back to Dr. Rice. They are still active in schools, as she said in the chat. And before we end, again, just a gentle reminder, I am going to put one more time in the chat. If you haven't signed in yet, either use the link or feel free to email me your name and the school. I do need to make sure I have you registered so that we can send you a copy of the presentation and the recording, give you credit for attendance. So I'm putting that in right now.
So I would like to thank you, Tanetta and Natalia. That was a lot of great information. And thank you all participants. I really appreciated all the engagement in the chat box. We have a great partnership with Western Tidewater Community Services Board, and so we plan on bringing you some more PD this year. And I think it's really important that you guys understand that culturally relevant teaching and mental health and social emotional learning, they're all going to be intertwined, and so you'll be getting more to come as the year progresses. I also need to let you know that you will be getting a tip sheet. It's going to be called the Crisis Response Tip Sheet for Virtual Learning. And it's going to give you basically a chronological order of how to respond if you do notice in your virtual format something unusual, something based on what you just learned in this presentation here today. So there's more to come, and you will get this tip sheet sometime later today. The ladies have shared their email. If you have more questions, you can certainly reach out to me as well. Your principals also have that registration link, and so that's also available to you if you need to get it that way. But again, we want to thank you ladies so much. That was so valuable, and we look forward to more PD from you. Everybody, I hope you have a great afternoon. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.